I'd known Eli Garrick the better part of 40 years, and I never once saw him look the way he did the morning he rode back into Cedar Hollow. He came up the wagon road out of the south timber with the early light behind him and a string of good horses on a lead, and he had the still, set face of a man riding to his own hanging. I was an old fool by then, mending a corral rail I had no real call to mend, and I knew him before he was close enough to hail. You always know the men you rode hungry with. I dropped my hammer in the dirt and stood there with my mouth half open, because Eli Garrick had been gone 15 years and 3 months, and the last I'd heard of him, he had a spread of his own 200 miles off and no reason on this earth to come back to the one place that had broken him. He reined up at my fence and looked at me a long while before he said a word. The years had put gray in his beard and weather in his face, and he sat a horse the way a wealthy man does now, easy and certain, but his eyes were the same eyes that had watched the Ashby place burn its lamps out across the meadow on 100 nights long ago. "Asa," he said, like the name cost him something. "You got old." "So did you," I said. "What in God's name brings you here?" He looked past me, up the green run of the valley to where the big house sat on its rise among the tall pines, white as a bone in the sun. And I understood then, the way you understand a thing in your gut before your head will own it, that he had not come for cattle or for land or for any of the reasons a sane man rides 200 miles. He had come for her. After 15 years he had come back for Lorna Ashby, and he did not yet know the one thing I had spent half my life not telling him. But I am ahead of the story, and an old man's privilege is to tell it slow. Let me go back to the beginning, to the spring we were both young and poor and didn't know any better than to be happy. We came into Cedar Hollow together, Eli and I, 2 saddled tramps with one good coat between us, hearing on at the Ashby Ranch the year I turned 20. Whitfield Ashby ran the biggest spread in the valley and most of the men in it, a tall, hard man with a voice that carried across a branding pen and a way of looking at a hired hand like he was pricing a horse. He paid fair and worked you to the bone and never once called you by your given name. To Whitfield Ashby you were the new man, or you were boy, or you were nothing at all. But the country was the prettiest I ever rode, all pine and meadow and the cold, bright run of Bell Creek down the middle of it, and the work was honest. And for 2 men who'd had neither home nor people since they were boys, it was as close to belonging as we'd ever come. Eli was the better hand by a long mile. He had a way with horses that wasn't a trick or a method, just a kind of patience that animals trust, and inside a season Whitfield had him breaking the colts and riding the high pastures and trusting him with things he trusted no other man. It went a none of us that this would matter later, that a poor man being good at his work would be the seed of all the grief that followed. At the time it just made me proud to be his friend. Whitfield Ashby had one child, and that was Lorna. Her mother had died bringing her, and the old man had raised her up alone in that white house with a hardness that he likely thought was love. She was 19 that spring, and I will not pretend to you that I can describe her so you'd see her, because beauty in a woman is the one thing words go lame trying to carry. I'll tell you instead what I remember. I remember she rode astride when her father wasn't looking and side saddle when he was, and that she could sit a green horse as well as any man on the place. I remember she was kind to the hands in a way that cost her nothing and meant everything, that she'd carry a jug of cold buttermilk out to the branding fire on a hot day, and stand there in the smoke laughing with us like she was one of us, and not the daughter of the man who owned the ground we stood on. And I remember that the first time she laughed at something Eli Garrick said, he went quiet for a full minute afterward, like a man who's heard a sound he means to remember the rest of his life. It started the way those things start, with nothing you could put your finger on. A word at the corral, her bringing a colt down for him to look at and the 2 of them leaning on the rail with their heads close. Him finding reasons to ride the pasture that ran under the house. I saw it before either of them owned it, the way you see weather coming over the ridge before the first cloud shows. I remember thinking, you damned fool, Eli, there is no road in this for you that doesn't end bad. And I remember not saying it, because there are some things a friend hasn't the right to say. By midsummer, they'd taken to meeting down at the bend of Bell Creek, where the cottonwoods made a screen, of an evening when the work was done. I knew because Eli told me, and because more than once he asked me to say he was off doctoring a sick horse if anyone came asking. I covered for him. I'd carry word between them when one couldn't get free. A folded scrap of paper passed hand to hand, and I felt like a man helping to build something fine and dangerous, and I never once thought to ask where it could possibly go. I asked him only one time, straight out. We were forking hay in the dark of the barn, and I said, "Eli, you know what he'll do if he finds out. He'll run you off this place and any other place in this valley he can reach, and that's a long reach." He didn't stop working. He just said, quiet, "I aim to marry her, Asa." "You aim to marry her," I said, "on 40 a month and found." "I won't always be on 40 a month," he said. "I'm saving every dollar. I've got it figured. 2 more years, 3 at the outside, I'll have enough to put down on the old Pell section up the North Fork, and I'll build her a house with my own hands, and I'll go to that man and stand in front of him and ask for her like I've got a right to. And by then I will have a right to." He set the fork down and looked at me in the lantern light, and there was a thing in his face I'd never seen on it before or expected to, a kind of certainty that didn't have any swagger in it at all. "She's not a thing I want, Asa. She's the whole reason. You understand me. A man finds the reason once if he's lucky. I found mine. I'm not going to spend my life acting like I didn't." I had no answer to that. I have no answer to it now. I have lived a long time and buried near everyone I cared for, and I have never found a thing to set against a man who has found his whole reason. So I picked my fork back up and we finished the hay, and I held my tongue, and I kept on carrying their folded scraps of paper down to the bend of the creek. God help me, because I believed him. I believed it would come out right because 2 people that good deserved it to. That was the kind of fool I was at 20. They were careful, but the valley is small and the old man missed nothing on his own ground. I have wondered since how he came to know. Maybe one of the hands carried tailies for the price of staying in his good graces. Maybe he saw it himself the way I had, in a laugh held a half beat too long. Maybe a daughter raised by a watchful man learns to be watched. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that on a gray morning in the late part of that summer, Whitfield Ashby sent for Eli to come up to the house, and Eli went, and he did not come back down the same man. I was at the corral when he came down. He walked like a man who'd been struck somewhere it didn't show. He went past me to the bunkhouse and started rolling his bed, and I followed him in and said, "Eli, Eli, what happened?" And for a while he wouldn't answer. Then he said in a flat, dead voice that scared me worse than shouting would have, "He knows. He's run me off. I've got till sundown to be off the place and out of the valley, and if I'm seen in it again, he says there's men in this country owe him favors who'll see I'm sorry." "Lorna," I said, "what about Lorna?" And here is the thing I have carried 15 years, the thing I would give my remaining days to have done different. Eli looked at me and he said, "He let her tell me herself." "Tell you what?" She'd thought better of it. His voice cracked right down the middle and he set his jaw against it. That it had been a summer's foolishness and she was ashamed of it now. That her father had a real match in mind for her, a man with land and standing, and she meant to take it. He yanked the strap tight on his bedroll. She stood right there on the porch beside him and said it to my face. Wouldn't hardly look at me. Said, "Go on now, Eli, and don't write and don't come back because there's nothing here for you." I did not believe it, even then. Raw as he was, I did not believe a word of it, and I told him so. I said, "That's not the woman I've watched all summer, Eli. That's a girl with her father's hand at her back and his eyes on her, saying the only words that'll get you off this place alive." I said, "Wait." I said, "Send for me when you've got the Pell section, and let me carry word to her without that old wolf standing over her." I said a dozen things, all of them true, and he heard none of them because a man's heart, once it has been told it is not wanted, will believe nothing else. It is the cruelest thing about us. We will doubt 100 kindnesses and swallow one cruelty whole. He rode out at sundown. I walked his horse to the gate with him because I could not let him go alone, and the last thing he said to me was, "Write me if she's happy, Asa, that's all. If you ever see she's truly happy, write and tell me and I'll be glad of it. But don't write me anything else. I can't carry anything else." Then he rode south into the dark and was gone, and I stood at the gate a long time. And up at the house I saw a lamp burning in the high window that was Lorna's room, burning late, burning all night. And I thought, that is not the window of a girl who thought better of anything. I did not get the chance to speak to her for near a week. The old man kept her close, but I caught her at last down at the spring house alone, and the moment she saw me her face came apart and she caught my sleeve and said, "Asa, Asa, where is he? He didn't even come to say goodbye. He just," Bessie says she saw him ride out at dark and he never even, and she couldn't finish. I stood there with the bottom going out of the world. "Lorna," I said careful, "didn't you speak to him on the porch before he left?" "What porch? What are you talking about? I haven't seen him in 9 days. Father's had me at the house. He said Eli had taken the trail drive money and run off south, that he'd been a thief all along, and she stopped. She read my face the way she could read a green horse off the broken side, and she went white. Asa, what did father tell him?" I told her. God forgive me, I stood in that spring house and told that girl that her father had stood her own self up on the porch in front of Eli, except it had not been her. It had been a lie wearing her name, and told the man she loved that she was ashamed of him and wanted him gone. And I watched the thing happen to her that I had watched happen to him, the heart taking the wound and closing over it. Except she did not believe it the way he had. She set her jaw and said, "I'll go to father. I'll make him tell me where Eli's gone, and I'll write to him, and I'll tell him it was a lie, every word." She went to her father. I don't know all of what passed between them, but I know the shape of it because I know what came after. Whitfield Ashby told his daughter that Eli Garrick was gone for good and glad to be, that he'd taken his pay and lit out the day he was let go and never asked after her once, that any letter she sent would chase a man who'd already forgotten her name. And when she said she'd write him anyway and let him answer for himself, her father said, "Write what you like," and she did. She wrote letters. I know she wrote them because I saw her carry them down to leave for the mail rider, week after week through that autumn, her face setting harder each time none came back. She wrote to the only place she had to send them, which was the address of the freight company that Eli had said he'd hire on with down south. And not one of those letters ever reached him, nor did one of his reach her. Because Whitfield Ashby had reached the mail rider before either of them, with money and with the long arm he'd warned about. And every letter that girl wrote and every letter that man wrote came back not to its sender, but into the hands of the man who'd torn them apart, and into a box, and into the dark. I did not know that part for 15 years. None of us knew it. We only knew that Eli wrote nothing and Lorna heard nothing, and that two people who had loved each other in plain sight of any fool with eyes had been taught, each of them, that the other had walked away without a backward look. By the time the snow came that first year, Lorna had stopped carrying letters to the gate. She had a stillness on her by then that I did not like to see on a girl of 19. And I, who knew that something was wrong clear to the marrow, could prove not one piece of it, and had a friend 200 miles gone who'd told me write nothing. I can't carry anything else. So I wrote him nothing, and the years closed over all of it like water over a stone. Now I have to tell you about the 15 years, and I will be quicker about them, because grief that goes on a long time tells short. Eli, I learned later, hired on with the freight company and then with a cattle outfit moving herds up out of the South Range, and he was good, and he was hungry the way only a wounded man is hungry, and he worked. He worked the way a man works who is trying to outrun something he carries in his own chest, and that kind of work, if it doesn't kill a man, will make him. In 10 years he had a piece of his own. In 15 he had a fine spread on good water and the respect of every man who dealt with him, and the name of being the squarest and the loneliest cattleman in 2 counties. He never married. He told me later there'd been a good woman once, a widow who'd have had him, and that he'd sat across her table one winter evening and known he had nothing under his breastbone to offer her but ashes, and that he'd been too honest to give her ashes and call it bread. So he stayed alone, and he built, and every dollar he laid by the way he'd told me he would all those years before, except now there was no house at the end of it for anybody, just more land and more cattle and the long habit of not stopping. And Lorna I had the watching of year on year because I never left Cedar Hollow. I stayed on at the Ashby place, and then, when the old man's temper ran off the rest of the crew, I stayed because somebody had to and because I could not have told you those years exactly what I was staying for. To watch over her, I suppose, in the only way a hired man can, which is from a distance and without ever saying so. Her father did the thing he'd told Eli he'd do. He brought up his real match, a man named Vernon Pell whose people held the section up the North Fork, the very ground Eli had meant to buy. Pell was not a cruel man, just an empty one, and he courted Lorna for the better part of 2 years with her father's whole weight behind it. And Lorna would not have him. She would not have him in a way that cost her dear, because Whitfield Ashby was not a man who took no from his own daughter gently. There was a bad winter in there, a winter the house was cold even with the fires roaring, when the old man and the girl did not speak except across the supper table, and not always then. But she held. She was 19 when they ran Eli off, and she was 21 when she faced her father down for the last time over Vernon Pell. And she stood in that front room and told him she would run the ranch for him until the day he died, and not one day past it would she let him sell her, and that if he wanted a son-in-law he could go marry one himself. And the old man, who'd broken horses and men and his own daughter's first love, found at last the one thing in this world he could not break, which was that same daughter grown. So she did not marry. She ran the place. As the years took the old man's legs and then his wind and then his temper down with the rest of him, it was Lorna who kept the books and rode the line and made the deals and held the Ashby name up in the valley, and she did it well, and the men who'd have laughed at a woman running a ranch learned to take their hats off when she rode by. She became, I will tell you plain, the finest person in that valley, man or woman. She had a kindness in her still, the same that had carried buttermilk to the branding fire, but it had steel under it now, the steel of someone who has paid full price for everything she's got. And under all of it, where she let no one see, she had a place that had been a lamp burning all night in a high window once, and had been dark for a long time since. Old Whitfield Ashby died on a hard March morning in the 15th year, of nothing in particular but the long bill all hard men come at last to pay. Lorna nursed him to the end with a duty in her that had no warmth left in it, which was no more than he'd earned. We buried him on the rise above the house, and the valley turned out the way it does for a big man, and afterward Lorna Ashby owned outright the biggest spread in Cedar Hollow and was, for the first time in her life, beholden to no living soul. She was 34 years old. And 6 weeks after we put her father in the ground, on a green morning in the late spring, Eli Garrick rode up the wagon road out of the south timber with a string of horses on a lead and the look of a man riding to his own hanging, and reined up at my fence and said, "Asa, you got old." He had come, he told me that first day, because word of the old man's death had finally reached him down south, carried the way news travels in cattle country, hand to hand at the railheads. He'd heard Whitfield Ashby was dead and the Ashby place would likely come up for sale, a great parcel of the best grass in the high country, and he was a cattleman with money to lay out, and so he'd come to buy land. That is what he told me, sitting his horse at my fence, and I will allow he may even have believed it. But I had watched him look up that valley at the white house on its rise, and I have lived long enough to know the difference between why a man says he's come and why he's come. He had come because the wall that stood between him and her for 15 years had finally been put in the ground, and some part of him that he would not say out loud, maybe not even to himself, had got on a horse and pointed it north before his head could talk him out of it. You know she never married, I said. He went still. I didn't, he said. No. Never. Turned down a good match and worse than good. Ran this whole valley single-handed near 10 years while the old man died by inches. I stopped, because I did not have the word and settled for, she's something to see, Eli. He looked at the ground a while. Then he said low, it doesn't change anything, Asa. A woman doesn't have to marry to have made her choice. She told me to my face. I don't. He stopped too. He was a man who'd built his whole life on one fact, that he had not been wanted, and you do not knock the foundation out from under a man with one sentence at a fence. I came to buy land, he said. If she'll sell it, that's the whole of it. It was not the whole of it, and we both knew it was not, and I let him keep the lie because it was the only floor he had to stand on. But I will tell you what went through my old head as he said it. I thought, he believes to this day that she stood on that porch and shamed him. He has carried that 15 years like a stone in his boot, and she believes he took his pay and rode off and never wrote her one word. And there is nobody alive but me who knows that neither of those things ever happened, and I can't prove a syllable of it. And the man who could is up there under the sod on the rise where I can't ask him a thing. I thought, Asa, you have got to fix this before one of them rides off again, and you spend the rest of your days knowing you stood at the fence and let it happen twice. I did not know how, but I knew it had to start with getting them in the same room, and so I did the only thing an old meddler could do. I rode up to the house that evening and I told Lorna Ashby that a cattleman from the south had come into the valley looking to buy grass, and that he was a square man I'd vouch for, and that she ought at least to hear his offer. I did not tell her his name. I have asked God's pardon for a good many things, but never for that. She came down to the corrals 2 mornings later to meet the buyer, and I stood off by the barn where I could see it, my heart going like a young man's. She rode down on a tall gray horse, sitting it the way she'd learned to sit when her father wasn't looking, all those years ago, and she dressed for business and not for any man, and she was every inch the woman who'd faced down Vernon Pell and her own father and the whole Doubting Valley. Eli was at the near corral with his horses. He turned when he heard her come, and I watched the two of them see each other for the first time in 15 years, and I have never before or since watched two people be struck so hard by the simple fact of another living person. He went the color of ash. She pulled the gray up so short it threw its head. For a long moment neither of them made a sound, and the only thing moving in the whole world was a meadowlark somewhere up the slope, just singing away like nothing at all was happening. Then Lorna Ashby got down off her horse, slow and very straight, and walked up to within 10 feet of the man she'd loved at 19, and stopped, and said in a voice scraped clean of everything, I was told a cattleman wanted to talk about grass. That's so, Eli said. His own voice wasn't much better. You've come a long way to buy grass, Mr. Garrick. She put a small, terrible weight on the name. There's good grass a deal closer to wherever it is you've made your home. There is, he said. Then I'll wonder why you rode 200 miles to buy mine. And there it was, laid out between them in the morning sun, the whole of it, and neither one able to say the true thing. I saw Eli open his mouth and shut it. I saw him decide, the way I'd seen him decide things for 40 years, to take the hard way because he thought it was the honest one. Because it's good land and I've money to spend, he said, and because I heard your father had passed and I thought, he stopped. He looked at her, and 15 years came up into his face all at once, and what he said next he said quiet and ruined, and I don't think he meant to say it at all. I thought maybe I could stand to be in this valley again, now he's gone out of it. Something crossed her face when he said now he's gone out of it. I couldn't read it from where I stood, but she stood very still, and then she said, cold as the creek in March, My father's been dead 6 weeks, Mr. Garrick, and you'll forgive me if I find it strange that the news brought you straight up the road you couldn't be bothered to send a single letter down for 15 years. And Eli Garrick, who had carried for 15 years the certain knowledge that she had thrown him over, heard her accuse him of being the one who never wrote and could make no sense of it at all. I watched the confusion go across his face like wind across water. Letters, he said. "Lorna, Miss Ashby, you told me not to write. You stood on your father's porch and told me yourself, don't write, don't come back, there's nothing here for you. Those were your words." "I never stood on any porch and said one word to you." She'd gone white again, the way she had in the spring house 15 years gone, and her voice was starting to shake under the cold. "I never saw you the day you left. I didn't know you'd gone till you were gone. And I wrote you." She caught herself. Pride is a terrible thing, and these were two of the proudest people the good Lord ever made. And I watched her haul the rest of that sentence back down her own throat rather than show him she'd written him letters he'd never answered. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It was a long time ago and we were young and foolish, and it doesn't matter now. If you want to talk about grass, come up to the house and I'll show you the boundaries. If you came for anything else, you've wasted your ride." She got back on the gray and rode up to the house, sitting so straight her back must have ached with it, and she did not look back even once, and Eli Garrick stood at the corral and watched her go with the look of a man who has just been handed a thing he can't make fit anywhere in 15 years of knowing. He came over to me slow. He said, "Asa." She says she never said it. "The porch." She says she never wrote. She started to say she did write and stopped. He took his hat off and dragged his sleeve across his forehead. "What is this? What's been done here?" "Come up to the house and talk grass with her," I said, because I'm an old coward and I wanted to be sure before I broke open 15 years. "Talk land, be square and be patient and don't push her." And Eli listened to her. Just listen. He talked grass with her that week, and the next. He was square and he was patient, the way only a man can be who has spent 15 years learning that you can't hurry a wounded thing. They rode the boundaries together. They sat over the maps in her father's study with the windows open to the meadow, and I'd find reasons to be near. And I will tell you it was the strangest courtship I ever watched. Two people doing sums about acres and water rights with the whole truth of their lives sitting in the room and neither one able to touch it. But I saw it thawing. I saw her laugh once, just once, at something he said about a contrary horse, and clap her hand over her mouth like she'd let out a secret. I saw him watch her ride away of an evening with his heart in his eyes. And I saw, too, that it could go either way, that the old lie was still standing square in the middle of the road between them. And that pride and 15 years were a current that could pull them both right past each other and out the other side, polite and ruined, a land deal done and 2 lives spent. It was Lorna who found the box. I should say that plain because it matters. It was not me that brought the truth to light in the end, though I'd carried half of it 15 years. It was Lorna Ashby who dragged it up out of the dark with her own 2 hands, and it could not have been anyone else, because the box was in her father's things, and only she had the right and the stomach to go through them. She'd been at it a month, the sorting of the old man's life, the way you have to after a death, the papers, the deeds, the locked drawers. And one evening near the end of June, she came to a strong box in the back of his closet that she'd had no key for, and she had the smith come and open it. And inside it she found, tied up in bundles with the old man's own string, every letter she had written to Eli Garrick in the autumn of her 19th year, every one of them come back to her father's hand, unopened by the man they were meant for. And beside them, in bundles just the same, every letter Eli Garrick had written to her across that same autumn, that she had never seen, never known existed, that had been taken off the mail rider and carried home and locked in the dark for 15 years by the man who slept now on the rise above the house. I know how she found it because she sent for me. It was full dark when the boy came down to the bunkhouse to say Miss Ashby wanted me at the house, and I went up, and the front room was lit, and Lorna was sitting at her father's desk with the box open in front of her, and the bundles of letters laid out, hers and his, and her face. I had known that woman from a girl, and I had never seen her face like that. It was not grief and it was not rage. It was both gone past the place where they have names, the face of someone standing in the wreck of 15 years they did not have to lose. She had one of Eli's letters open in her hands. She'd been reading them, I think, the whole evening, all of them, working her way down through 15 years of a young man's heart in the order he'd poured it out. "Asa," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very level, the way the creek is quiet just above the falls. "Did you know?" I could have lied. I'm not proud of how near I came to it. "I knew he never said he'd quit you," I said. "I knew you never said it to him. I knew there'd been a lie told both ways the day he left. I didn't know about." I looked at the letters. "I didn't know about these. I swear it to you on whatever you'll have me swear it on. I never knew the letters got through to your father instead of past him. I thought they'd just gone nowhere. I thought you'd both quit writing. I never knew he had them. Lorna, I never knew there was a box." She believed me. I think she could tell, the way she could tell a thing off the broken side. She looked back down at the letter in her hands and read a piece of it again, and her mouth worked, and she read it out loud, low, like she had to hear it in the air to believe it was real. It was from the second winter he'd been gone, 2 years after, and it said, "I'll not give you all of it. A man's heart laid bare like that isn't mine to hand around." But it said that he'd taken the Pell section talk as proof she'd done what she said, and that he didn't blame her, that a girl ought to take the better life, but that he wanted her to know he'd hold no grudge and wish her well till the day he died. And that he was writing this last letter not to win her back, but only because a man can't carry a thing forever without setting it down once, and this was him setting it down, that loving her had been the one wholly good thing he'd ever done, and that he'd count his life well spent for it even if she never read a word. She set the letter down. She put both her hands flat on the desk like she needed the wood to hold her up. And then Lorna Ashby, who had not wept in front of any living soul since she was 19 years old, put her face down on 15 years of stolen letters and wept like the dam of her whole life had broke. I stood there. There wasn't a thing in the world for an old man to do but stand there and let her, so I did, and I'll own my own eyes weren't dry. When she'd cried it out, she sat up and wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand, the way she did everything, like there was work in it, and she looked at me and her eyes were red but they were steady, and she said, "He thinks I threw him over." "He's thought it 15 years, I said. "He thinks I stood on that porch and shamed him and took up with Vernon Pell." She said it slow, like she was turning it in her hand to see all its sides. "And I thought he took his pay and rode south and forgot my name inside a season." She looked down at the 2 boxes of letters, his and hers, 15 years of 2 people writing into the dark and the dark eating every word. "My father did this," she said. "My own father sat in this house all those years with these in his closet, watching me not marry, watching me run his ranch and grow old in it, and he kept this box. He kept it. He could have burned them and I'd never have known, and he didn't even do that. He kept them locked up where he could go and look at them, I suppose, every time he wanted to be sure of what he'd done." She was very quiet a moment. "I will not waste another hour hatting a dead man," she said at last. "He has had all the years of mine he's going to get." And she stood up. "What'll you do?" I said. She gathered Eli's letters up gentle, all of them into a stack, and held them against her like something living. "I'll go to him," she said, "and I'll give him these and I'll tell him the truth, and then it'll be his to do with what he wants. Maybe 15 years is too much. Maybe we're not the people we were and there's no road back to it. That's as may be, but he is going to know Asa. He has carried that lie a day too long already, and not one more day of it will I let him carry if it's in my power to take it off him. He's owed the truth whatever comes after. We both are. That, you understand, is the whole of why I loved that woman like she was my own, though she never knew it. She had every right to sit in her grief and her riches and let the proud silence have its way. Instead, she stood up at near midnight with her enemy 15 years in the grave, and gathered up the proof of all she'd lost and went to give it freely to the man who thought the worst of her, not knowing if it would buy her anything at all. There is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with facing down a stampede or a gun. It is the courage to walk toward someone with the truth in your open hands and no promise it'll be taken kindly. I have seen the other kind aplenty. I have seen this kind only a few times, and one of them was that night. She didn't go that night, mind. There's a difference between courage and recklessness, and she was no green girl. She slept on it, what little she slept, and in the cool of the next morning she had a hand saddle the gray, and she put the bundle of his own letters in her saddlebag, and she rode down to where Eli had made his camp by the south corrals while the land talk went on. I did not go with her. I'd done my part and worse, and this was theirs. But Eli told me after, near all of it, and I'll give it to you the way he gave it to me, because the man could not tell it without his voice going, even then, even old. He said she rode up while he was at his coffee and got down and stood there with a leather bundle in her hands and her face set like a person who's made up her mind to a hard thing. He said he stood up and didn't know what to say, and she didn't give him the chance to need to. She said, "Eli, I have something of yours. You'll want to sit down to read it and I'll wait, and when you're done I'll tell you the rest." And she put the bundle in his hands, and it was his own letters, 15 years of them, that he'd written into nothing and that had come back unopened to her father's box. And on the top one, he saw his own hand and the old freight company address scratched out, and Whitfield Ashby's name written under it in the old man's writing, where the mail rider had been told to send them. And he understood the whole of it. He said, in about the time it takes a man's heart to stop and start again. He read them, all of them, sitting on a stump by his dead fire while she stood off by the horses with her back to him, giving him the decency of not being watched. He read 15 years of his own grief, that he'd thought he'd thrown into a void, and he understood that it had not gone into a void, it had gone into a box kept by a man who'd wanted to be sure. And that the woman whose pride he'd cursed for 15 years had never thrown him over at all, had been told the same lie pointed the other way, had written him letters of her own that he'd never see because she'd burned them. She told him later. She'd burned hers the day she found his. She couldn't bear to give a man back his own letters and her own both. His were proof enough. He read them, and when he was done, he sat on that stump a long while with the papers in his hands and his head down, and Lorna Ashby stood by the horses with her back to him and let him have it, the way she'd have let a green horse have its time. When he could, he stood up and he came to her and she turned around. And he said, "This is the part he could never tell me with his voice steady, so I'll just give you the words," he said. "I have thought ill of you every day for 15 years. I built my whole life on it. I made it the floor I stood on." He held up the letters. "And it was a lie. The floor was a lie. Lorna, I don't know how to ask you to forgive a man who thought that of you all this time." And she said, "You don't have to ask. You didn't think ill of me. You thought ill of a thing my father said in my name and dressed up to look like me. That's not the same as thinking ill of me, and I won't have you carry it like it is. And then this is her, this is the whole of her," she said. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that 15 years didn't happen, Eli. They happened. We're not the two by the creek. You've built a life, and so have I, and they're real lives and they're good ones, and I won't pretend they're nothing. But I'll tell you what's true, the same as I came to tell you. I never quit you. I never wanted Vernon Pell or any man my father pushed at me. I ran this ranch and I told myself I'd made my peace, and I had not made my peace. I just got good at the lie, the way you did. And now there's no lie left for either of us to stand on." She looked up at him, and Eli said her chin came up the way it had at the corral the first day, proud and scared both. "So I'm asking you, not the girl I was, me, the way I am now, 34 and set in my ways and the owner of more cattle than I rightly want. Is there anything left in you that wants to find out what we'd be, starting from the ground we're standing on? Because there's everything left in me. I just need to know if I'm standing here alone. I wasn't there, you understand." But Eli told me he didn't say anything at all for a moment, because he couldn't, and then he didn't say anything because there wasn't a word for it. And then he reached out and took her hand, just her hand, the two of them grown and gray at the temple standing by a dead campfire, and him taking her hand the way he might have done 15 years before by the bend of Bell Creek and never got to do enough, and he said, "You're not standing there alone. You haven't been, Lorna. I just couldn't get word to you for 15 years. And she laughed with the tears running at that, because it was exactly the kind of dry, foolish, true thing the man would say. And then I expect they neither of them said much for a while, and it's none of my business nor yours what they did or didn't, except that he told me he held her, finally, after 15 years just held her, and that it was worth every mile of the road and every dark year to have got there. They were married in the late summer, in the little white church in Harmon's Crossing, and the whole valley came, the same valley that had once taken its hat off to her riding by and would now take it off to the both of them. There was no great to-do made about the 15 years. People knew the shape of it. A valley can't keep a thing like that quiet, but Lorna and Eli neither one cared to make a tale of their own grief for folks to chew on, and so it was just a wedding, a fine plain one, two people not young getting what they'd been owed a long time. I stood up with Eli, because there was no one else on God's earth who'd have the right, and my hands shook so I near dropped the ring, and he steadied them with his own, the way he'd steadied his green horses and his green friend for 40 years. He did buy the land, in a manner of speaking. The Ashby place and his own southern spread were too far apart to run as one, so he sold the southern outfit, every acre and head of it that he'd bled 15 years to build, and brought the money north, and they put it into Cedar Hollow, into the green grass under the White House, and made it theirs together, not his and not hers but theirs, her name and his on the deed both, which she insisted on and which he'd have insisted on too if she hadn't beat him to it. And the old Pell section up the North Fork, the very ground Eli had dreamed of buying for her when he was a hand on 40 a month, that came up for sale a few years on, and they bought it. And Eli built a house on it with his own hands the way he'd told me he would in a dark barn a lifetime before. And they'd ride up there of a Sunday in the good weather and sit on the porch he'd built and look out over the country, the two of them. Grown old together after all in the place, where they'd nearly never got to be young. I am older now than Whitfield Ashby ever got to be, and that's a strange thought to an old man. I've outlived the wicked and the kind both, which is the way of it. The Lord doesn't sort us out by our deserving when it comes to years. But I'll tell you the thing I think on, when I sit out in the evening, and watch the lamps come up across the valley the way Eli used to watch them when he was a boy in love and not allowed to be. I think on how near it came to never being. How a man told one lie out of a hard heart and split two good lives clean in half, and how that lie stood for 15 years on nothing, but the fact that two proud people each believed they hadn't been wanted. And I think on how it took just one person in the end, not me, with all my knowing and my cowardice, her, with her courage, to gather up the truth in her two hands and carry it across a campfire and lay it down, not knowing what she'd get for it, only knowing it was owed. That is the whole of what I've learned in a long life, and I'll give it to you for what it's worth. The dark will keep a thing forever if you let it. A box in a closet, a lie on a porch, a love you've decided wasn't wanted, the dark will hold it as long as you'll leave it there, 15 years, 50, the rest of your days. But it cannot stand one honest hand reaching in and bringing the thing out into the light. It never could. I watched a woman do it once late, but not too late, and I watched a hard man's whole life turn from ashes to bread in the doing, and I have never since been able to believe that any darkness is as strong as it lets on. They were married 31 years. He went first, as the bigger ones often do, easy in his bed in the house he'd built her on the North Fork, and she sat with him at the end the way she'd once sat a green horse, steady, unafraid. And she told me after that the last thing he said was her name, just her name, like the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. She followed him inside the year. We buried them up on the North Fork together, well away from the rise where her father lies, and I see to the grave still, what's left of me. And there's never a year I don't put fresh ground flowers there in the late spring when the meadow comes green for the two of them, and for the boy and the girl by the bend of Bell Creek, who got their ending after all, 15 years late and worth every day of the wait.